I'm really thrilled to be here today with Ruth Milkman, who is a giant as both a scholar of the history and sociology of work and also as a real committed longtime movement intellectual. Ruth is a past president of the American Sociological Association, and she's written extensively on the changing character of capital and labor within just about every industry you can think of, from the automotive to agricultural to domestic work to the gig economy, hotels, building services, much more. It honestly take a better part of an hour, the hour that we have here, to run through her various accomplishments. So I'll leave it there and just remind everyone that Ruth is the chair of labor studies at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies, where I'm very lucky to count her as a colleague and a mentor. Today, we're going to be talking about Ruth's really terrific new book, Immigrant Labor and the New Precariat, published last year by Polity. So, Ruth, thanks so much for doing this. And before we get started, anything else you want to add by way of introduction?
Thank you for a great introduction, Samir, and I'm delighted that you're my colleague too.
And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So, to start, I would begin by asking what led you to write this book. But in this case, I think the context is pretty clear. You conceptualized and wrote this when the Trump administration was weaponizing what you call the immigrant threat narrative. Basically, the idea that immigrants are coming into the US and taking all the jobs because they're willing to work for less than workers born in this country. Now, most of us, I think, and most of the audience here understands that Trump's rhetoric on that was violently racist and xenophobic. But many decent people, I suspect, including some nominally progressive writers, do accept the rather simplistic supply and demand argument, which holds that more people entering the country and competing for a fixed number of jobs will serve to undermine US workers' bargaining power. In the book, you make a very clear and powerful argument against this view. So can you start by just laying out the central thesis of the book?
Sure. Let me preface it, though, by saying that this immigrant threat narrative, as I call it, predates the rise of Donald Trump and persists in his absence, or whatever we call the current silence from the former president. So it's not, he definitely amplified it and made it much more central to the political conversation, but it's not gone, and it's been around for quite a long time. So I just wanted to say that. And it also, the narrative is not just that immigrants are a threat to so-called American jobs, but also a burden in terms of, taxpayers' expenses for education and health and so on. And as you may recall, Trump famously asserted that immigrants bring crime with them. Actually, the opposite is true, but there's less evidence of criminal activity among immigrants than among US-born folks, and so on. So, and as you said, there is a version of this on the left, which is more focused on the economic side, as this idea that open borders, quote unquote, which some people on the left do advocate, but that's not really my position. In any case, the claim is that open borders and therefore a larger labor supply, due to immigration, is good for the bosses and not good for workers and their unions. So that view is around. Basically, what I try to argue in the book is that the story is a little more complicated than supply and demand. The key point in that regard is that immigrants rarely compete directly with US-born workers. Their employment is concentrated in particular segments of the labor market, often growing segments, and also places that have undergone major restructuring and transformation to the point where what were once desirable, decent jobs with reasonable wages and sometimes even things like health insurance coverage and pensions, were transformed by employers into undesirable, degraded jobs. And the process I try to trace historically in the book is that in many industries, when that transformation occurs, when unions are destroyed or weakened, when jobs are, when deregulation leads to changed conditions in the workplace and so on, US-born workers often abandon jobs that were formerly desirable, but now seem extremely unappealing. So those who have other options go for them. And that's when employers start actively hiring and recruiting immigrants. And it is true that some of those immigrants are already around when this occurs, but the supply is actually not adequate to meet the needs of employers in low-wage jobs in the period, in the neoliberal period, basically. This is not true right now, given the pandemic and everything, but for several decades. And so then employers actually actively solicit immigrants to come across the border, or, you know, they're not all from Mexico and Central America, but from wherever. They recruit refugees, et cetera. So that's the story that I basically try to trace. And I guess we're going to talk about the details shortly.
Yeah, no, and I mean, this is a really important intervention, and so I just want to make sure that the listeners kind of have a handle on it. I mean, the point, Ruth, that you're outlining is that causality in terms of immigration moves in the opposite direction than the conventional argument asserts. So in other words, immigration didn't contribute to, you know, deteriorating quality of jobs in you know, various industries that we'll talk about, but rather that the deterioration in the quality of those jobs created demand among employers for immigrant workers who they believe they could control more easily, exploit more easily, and so on. At the same time, you do make it a point in the book to challenge the idea that this is simply a product of immigrants coming here to do jobs that Americans don't want. Specifically, you take the examples of residential construction, building services, meatpacking, and trucking to show that these used to be jobs that Americans did want. And once upon a time, they were stable union jobs, not all of them, but large slices of those industries. Over the years, though, you say these jobs have been degraded, and that this degradation resulted in the, as you say, the exit of US-born workers, which in turn led employers to more actively recruit immigrant workers and others. So can you talk about how exactly this process played out and why it affected the specific industries that you cover?
Well, so it's slightly different in the different industries, but let me give a couple of examples. So first of all, trucking. As I think most of the people in this listening audience probably are aware, trucking used to be a pretty highly unionized industry, especially long haul trucking. The Teamsters Union, that was its central constituency. And when the industry was deregulated in the late 70s, culminating in the Motor Carrier Act of 1980, it was transformed almost overnight. The union was dramatically weakened. Many of the jobs were converted from regular hourly jobs to owner-operator type jobs, and subcontracting became pervasive in the industry. And as that occurred, those who could either migrated into other sectors of trucking that remained, you know, unionized, or just went into other kinds of fields, and both the pay and the benefits deteriorated dramatically. And so increasingly, well, I look, the sector where immigrants are most concentrated is actually in the trucking at the nation's ports. On both coasts, this is the case. And those jobs were particularly badly affected by these changes. So that's one kind of case where deregulation is sort of the main motor of wage deterioration and so on, and job deterioration. And those jobs, by the way, become what were once hourly jobs become, in the case of the ports, people are paid by the truckload, and they're not paid at all for the time they spend hanging around waiting for a job, which is often many hours in between. Also that, you know, and because they're theoretically self-employed independent contractors, there are no benefits. They're not protected by any of the labor and employment laws that employees are covered by, similar to Uber drivers, for example. Okay, so that's one kind of case. In things like, well, residential construction is another interesting one. So there, again, that's an industry that people now just assume is a low-wage, immigrant-dominated industry, but not that long ago, half a century ago, in the West and in the North and in the Midwest, it was highly unionized. And the workers were mostly white men. They're now men of color, mostly Latinx, but other ethnicities too. And there it's a little different because there is an opportunity when the residential construction sector became non-union, which happened very rapidly in the 80s and 90s, 1980s and 90s, that is, many workers who had been employed there just moved into commercial construction, which in many periods during that time was booming. So it was easy to do that. The construction employers went on the rampage against unions in a very deliberate way. This has been, I mean, I refer to it in the book, but it's been documented extensively by others, especially for anyone interested in a book by Mark Linder called Wars of Attrition is probably the best single thing to read about that. But so that began quite early, actually in the late 1960s, and was very successful. And it focused mainly on the residential sector. Commercial construction remains a sector where unions have a strong presence, though less extensive than in the past. So the unions didn't really fight back very seriously against the loss of residential construction. This mostly occurs in periods of economic downturns, whereas we saw most dramatically in the Great Recession, construction in that sector particularly basically stops dead. And the question is, when it comes back, will it come back in the form of union or non-union contracting? And so the unions pretty much abandoned that territory, and those who worked in it before, many of them move into commercial construction, which is the same organizations and relatively straightforward matter for during periods of boom, like the 80s, most importantly, there were great building booms in a lot of major cities. And that's when the industry is completely transformed into one dominated by immigrants. And there you see the replication of forms of, and construction always was an industry with lots of layers of subcontracting. That's nothing new. But what changes now is that at the bottom level, very much like in agriculture, immigrant middle people, well, they are all men pretty much, middlemen, who are bilingual and have both access to communities where they can recruit workers and are in contact with the contractors, they become the kind of key nodes of immigrant recruitment, sometimes among immigrants who are already present in the US, but often through networks that take them south of the border. So that really takes off in the 80s and 90s, and the industry becomes, transformed overnight. One interesting tidbit on that, which is also true in some other cases like meat packing, which maybe I'll say something about in a minute. The employers at first are a little skeptical about this. It takes them a while. They do eventually come to the view, which you've heard probably recently, that, oh, immigrants are much better workers than US born workers. They eventually get there. But in the beginning, they're kind of skeptical. These folks don't speak English. What are they going to be like? There's a sort of anxiety in the early stages, which I think is important because it shows that this was not really planned by employers. It's not like they set about figuring out, well, let's get rid of the US born workers and hire immigrants instead. It wasn't really like that. It's kind of a step-by-step progression. And eventually they get to the point where that's who they're recruiting. So it's more that they are unable to attract US born workers at the newly degraded wages and working conditions that emerge. Anyway, so and that happens in construction and in meat packing, which is different in that it's really formal employment, unlike construction where there's a lot of all cash payment and all sorts of other so-called informal labor market practices that kind of take hold as the industry is transformed. In meatpacking, as we've seen during the pandemic, they're basically like factories that, people get checks for their pay and compensation and so on. And there the restructuring is tied to a broader change in the industry where slaughterhouses that used to be located in urban areas moved to where the cattle are bred, which happen to be right to work states like Iowa and Nebraska and so on. And they're glad to, weaken the union or get rid of it completely in those cases. But again, then that's not really the main objective. It's sort of an efficiency move that it's cheaper to do go to where they call it final feeding takes place. And but what that means is that they need to recruit workers from those new geographical regions. And they think in the beginning that they can do that by recruiting women, for example, who are in farming areas and are not fully employed, other, young people in those areas who might not, who need jobs. One of the things that fascinated me was coming across a case where they actually, in one meatpacking plant, they actually built a daycare center in the hope that, women who had kids who would be attracted to the job. And what they found is that they initially do employ US born workers of, not just women, but in general. And the turnover rates are sky high, sometimes like 300 and 400%. People are willing to try these jobs, but then they see how awful they are. And I think most people who are listening to this probably are familiar with, from all the publicity that there's been about this industry recently. This is not a fun job. But although for immigrants, it's often a better option than some of the existing alternatives. And I should have said this before, the study that this book is about low-wage immigrants. I'm not talking about Silicon Valley engineers and all. I mean, that's definitely worthy of study, but that's not what this is about. But so if you're somebody who doesn't have a lot of formal education, maybe doesn't speak English and so on, this is actually better than a lot of the alternatives, say agriculture or cleaning houses or whatever. But so they do attract immigrants and refugees. But again, initially they try to use US born workers. That's the goal of the employers. And once that fails, once they see that people just aren't willing to put up with the work the way it's currently structured, or the way it was structured in this period of transition, they increasingly turn to immigrants. So that's just another variation. So they're all a little bit different, but the basic pattern is the same across all these cases.
Right, right. And while you're talking about I mean, just the meatpacking, I'm thinking this morning there's a big story in the New York Times on the RWDSU, the Retail Wholesale Department Store Union, which is organizing at the Amazon warehouse, and they represent many poultry and other meat plants in the South that have large immigrant workforces as well. So that's worth checking out for any listeners. But I think it's really important that you know that this wasn't some grand design by employers, but was wound up with broader political economic shifts over the last few decades, that have sort of created the conditions within which employer demand for sort of highly, what they see as exploitable immigrant labor has increased. And this is wound up, and we'll talk about this a little bit in a bit, but with sort of the decline of the New Deal regulatory order, and with the increasing levels of inequality and larger structural trends over the past few decades. And you also have, in the book, you talked about how all of this also affected immigrant women workers in specific ways. And in particular, you highlight domestic work and low-wage service industries like restaurants and nail salons. And here again, like you say, that in each of these places and sectors, the dynamics are a little bit different, but they're all sort of related in ways. So could you talk a little bit about the sort of gender component of this in some of these other sectors?
Yeah, well, with the exception of meatpacking, which employs women as well as men, the other cases that we talked about before are very male-dominated: trucking, construction, and so on. But yeah, so the story, it's parallel, but there's a little different twist in the case of these female-dominated fields. The one I know the most about is paid domestic work, maids, nannies, and so on. These jobs, as everyone I think listening probably is well aware, were once dominated by African American women until the 1970s or so. That was the case. And actually those jobs were declining in importance. That is, in how many people were doing that kind of work in that period, because in the New Deal period, when the period of the so-called Great Compression and income inequality, not as many people relied on paid domestic work. They did it, more of it themselves back then. And so, in fact, there were sociologists who wrote obituaries for the occupation in the 1960s and 70s, saying this was a declining, industry that was going to go the way of elevator operators or something. Well, that obviously didn't happen. Instead, what happened was two things. One was that the civil rights movement successfully opened up other employment opportunities for Black women in this period, in the starting basically in the 70s. And there's this massive exodus from domestic service jobs. for all kinds of reasons. I mean, they were, unlike in, say, trucking or construction, these were never good jobs. They were not unionized, they didn't pay very much, et cetera. They were always degraded. So that's one big difference from the male-dominated sectors we just talked about. And also for many African Americans, there was a kind, they sort of stank of the legacy of slavery in many cases, since there was a kind of straight line from that to domestic service historically. So and anyway, once other opportunities opened up, which did happen in the 1970s, where these, Black women got access to clerical and service jobs, sales jobs in some cases, a lot of public sector employment opened up. So they just abandoned this whole territory. And meanwhile, something else is going on, which is as inequality starts to expand in the neoliberal years, more and more people can afford domestic labor. This is a kind of whole other topic, but so I once studied this a little bit in other countries. And if you look at, say, Scandinavia, where income inequality in those days was very flat, that there was very little inequality. Hardly anyone employed domestic servants. That's begun to change there even too, but in recent years. But so in order to, if you just think about it logically, if you want to employ a whole other person to take care of your household, especially if it's a full-time housekeeper or nanny or something, if income inequality is compressed, you can't really afford that. You have to pay them what you earn. But as inequality grows, it becomes more and more affordable. So there's that. There's other factors too, like the aging of the population, more and more mothers in the paid labor force who need childcare and so on. So for a lot of different reasons, there's an expansion of demand at the same time as the supply of workers in domestic service basically evaporates. And so that it becomes, now I think we all think of it as an immigrant dominated occupation, but that wasn't true half a century ago. So it's parallel to what happens in the male dominated sectors, but with a different motor of change.
Right. And I guess, I mean, in sort of grabbing onto the common thread here, which is, I suppose, to put it just simply, I guess we could say the decline of the New Deal order that maybe we could say lasted from the 30s through the mid 60s, and the rise of the neoliberal order of degradation of work, deunionization, increasing inequality, all of these things. That frame helps make sense of the various currents that you've described. And on that, some historians, and Jeff Cowie is a historian who's made this point most forcefully, has argued that the heyday of New Deal liberalism, that period prior to the time we're now talking about, was exceptional, and that it was exceptional in part because during those years immigration was highly restricted. On its face, this sort of makes some sense. In 1924, there's a law that's passed that sets strict limits on immigration, and that policy isn't changed until 1965. So prior to the New Deal, right? Prior to 1924, lots of immigration largely from Eastern and Southern Europe. And since the 60s, lots of immigration from Latin America and Asia. And, I'm personally a beneficiary of the 1965 law. In both of these periods, pre-New Deal and post-New Deal, the high level of immigration correlates with increasing inequality, weakening unions, and so on. So, I mean, one could look at this and say, well, the New Deal was only effective because of the unusually low rate of immigration during those years, and it's impossible to get back to anything like it as long as we have so much immigration. And you offer a very different take on this history. So could you explain your perspective and what you see as some of the problems with that argument that I just outlined?
Sure. Well, so I guess the short version of my response is simply that correlation is not causation. So obviously there is a strong correlation, as you just described, and I think Cowie and others make a powerful case along those lines, but they don't really nail it down. And I think it's impossible to do so because the dynamics are so much more complex. Also, if you look at other countries, which I do very briefly in the book, you can see that these two trends are not always correlated. In other words, you can have immigration without decommodification, the decline in regulation and unionization, and vice versa. So yeah, and again, I just try to argue that the sequence of events is what matters. That if you look carefully at the history of these different industries, you see that it's the decline in unionization that comes first, for example, or deregulation comes first, and then you see the growth of immigrants. Whereas the other argument implies that the causation goes in the other direction. That once you have immigrants come in, you can proceed to degrade the jobs. And so, if you just look at the timing of what happens when, it's pretty clear that the opposite is the case, at least in the cases I examined. The industries I looked at.
Right. And, I mean, it just seems like this argument has real tremendous stakes right now, given everything that's going on. And, we are, who knows what we're entering in terms of social and economic policy. But as you say, the immigrant threat narrative that Trump championed, but certainly didn't, invent, is still very much with us. And I think, sort of getting to the bottom of this question around the great exception, as it's been called in one book on this, is really important. So I think you really help us think about that. I guess maybe, we've talked about sort of the structural dynamics and how all this has figured into, rates of immigration. Moving maybe more to the I suppose, the political side of this, it's notable, I think, and I think many of our sort of listeners will be familiar with some of this, that many of the most exciting and successful struggles within the labor movement in recent decades have been led by immigrant workers and immigrant women, in particular, employed in service occupations like hospitality, office cleaning, domestic work, and so on. And some of this activity, and this is, I think, an interesting thing that it's just like this question has a couple layers, but I think it's worth just spending some time on and unpacking. Some of this activity has occurred within traditional labor unions, like SEIU, Unite Here, prior to the merger, HERE, hotel workers, service employees. And a lot of it's also occurred through newer organizations, like the National Domestic Workers Alliance, for instance, workers centers around the country, alt labor groups, and so on. So I guess first, I'm wondering if you can talk about why you think this is. Why have immigrant workers been at the forefront of some of the most dynamic struggles over the last few decades? And related to that, if you could share your perspective, which is an important and unique one, I think, on why this particular set of organizations has been involved. And just for our listeners to kind of provide some context, SEIU, for instance, and Unite Here, or HERE, have histories going quite a ways back to the American Federation of Labor, an organization typically associated as being white male craft workers. And historically, that's not an inaccurate description. Organizations like National Domestic Workers Alliance are much newer, having been formed in the last couple of decades. And what's absent from this list are the famous CIO unions, the ones that led the great wave of labor militancy in the 1930s. So, why is all of this the way it is?
Well, yeah, this is a really important point in my view. Well, first of all, if you think about the CIO unions, and I have to say that my generation, which is a little older than yours, Samir, we grew up thinking that this was the sort of progressive center of labor activity, the UAW especially, in the 70s and even 80s that's where we looked to see progressive labor activity. And what has happened to those unions in the years since is that basically the rug has been pulled out from under them by deindustrialization. In the auto industry is a great example, right? The UAW used to be the biggest union in the United States with over 1 million members. And, as the factories closed or moved abroad or whatever, that and transplants from other countries that are non-union took their place in some cases, the industry dwindled. So, they were kind of holding on by the edge of their nails to what remained, but they were not, except for doing things like organizing teaching assistants around the country and stuff like that. They weren't really in a position to do immigrant organizing per se, right? And that's true of most manufacturing unions. Oddly enough, this is kind of an aside, but the anti-immigrant animus is often very strong in deindustrialized parts of the country, like, the so-called Rust Belt in the Midwest and so on. Even though, first of all, no one could blame immigrants for the closing of factories and their movement abroad, right? They just gone. There's no immigrants taking jobs there. There aren't any jobs to take. And yet the kind of dispossession that's gone on for those workers, and we've seen it in electoral politics too, has created made the Trump immigrant threat narrative, and more generally that kind of xenophobic politics, quite appealing in those sectors. So that's sort of a whole other problem. But basically what's left standing as those old CIO unions are decimated by these changes are the former AFL affiliates. So for people who aren't labor historians or familiar with the details of this, I know you are, Samir. I'll just very quickly say that the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, was founded in the late 19th century and originally included mostly craft unions of skilled workers and other kinds of occupational unions. And when, by the time the CIO comes along in the 1930s, industrial unionism, organizing whoever the boss hires in, say, the auto industry or the steel industry or whatever industry, becomes the more, the rival form of unionism. The AFL actually continues to grow in those years, and many of those unions become quasi-industrial unions and so on, and then they merge in 1955 into what is today the AFL-CIO, although a few of them left the AFL-CIO in the early 21st century. Anyway, so the AFL unions are what's left standing, aside from public sector, which isn't really relevant to this story because very few immigrants work in that sector, though more and more are beginning to, the ones who've been here a long time. So, people aren't necessarily aware of this, but SEIU is an AFL union originally, though it's founded in the 1920s, not in the 19th century, but still. As is HERE. Dorothy Sukabel has written brilliantly about the ways in which those unions are much better suited, she argues, to the so-called post-industrial economy that emerges in the late 20th century. And those are also the sectors that begin to employ immigrants in large numbers for the reasons we've already talked about. So they become, in some ways, the center of, insofar as there's traditional unionism, as you said, involved in immigrant organizing, this is where it comes from. SEIU and HERE are two of the leaders. And there's actually some in residential construction by the Carpenters Union and the Laborers Union and so on as well. So that's where the action is. And to be clear, the skepticism that I mentioned before among employers about hiring immigrant workers, many unionists in the early days of these transitions are also deeply skeptical. How could you organize these immigrants? They may not even stick around. They're just here to make money and go home. They're anyway, and if they're undocumented, they're going to be too terrified to organize and all. And it's not that those arguments are wrong, but those concerns are kind of trumped, pardon the expression, by other factors that actually make immigrants quite receptive to organizing efforts when the opportunities arise, which we should remember isn't as often as one might like. So the iconic case of all this is Justice for Janitors, which I imagine most people listening have had some familiarity with, which in the beginning, people are deeply skeptical, that I was too, actually, when this first emerged. And then it's a spectacular success, and organizers begin to figure out that actually immigrants are quite eager to organize given the opportunity. And some of the same motives that lead to immigration itself, a desire to advance economically, make unionization very appealing. And it's not that the fear is absent, but it's for people who are undocumented and have done things like cross the border illegally, organizing is not as threatening as some of the other experiences they've been through, it turns out. So yeah, there's some fear, and there's probably much more recently, but in the period where all this is happening in the 80s and 90s, it's not a big deal compared to what they've been through before. And I remember one interview that we did a long time ago in LA, where somebody involved in Justice for Janitors said, well, in my country, if you organize a union, they murder you. Here, you lose a minimum wage job. Like, no big deal, right? I mean, so anyway, so pretty soon organizers are saying, oh, organizing immigrants, that's much easier than organizing US born workers. Um, and then as for the worker centers, like the domestic workers and the others, that's quite different. They aren't conventional unions, but they focus on industries and occupations where unions are basically either absent or have disappeared. And it turns out that although they're very typically quite modest organizations in both size and resources, are much more able to strategize in innovative ways about how to name and shame employers, draw attention to the terrible conditions that these workers face. And they are focused on the low wage sectors of the economy, which is where immigrants are. So they become the champions of immigrant workers and are quite successful in, well, not organizing them into unions in most cases, although some try to do that, but more often in trying to get new laws to improve conditions and create new arenas of struggle for more rights and so on. Yeah, so it's complicated. I would say that the immigrant rights movement itself, which we haven't heard from so much recently, although I hope it will reemerge now that Trump is gone, also is in a way is a kind of labor movement. This is my claim, because after all, trying to get status for the 11 million unauthorized immigrants is a way of improving their economic prospects and also protecting US born workers from, further degradation of their jobs. So anyway, so that's another place where there's a lot of organizing in the period I write about.
Right. And, it's interesting because we say, I pose the question as if it's kind of, notable that immigrant workers have been at the leading edge of organizing struggles in recent decades. But thinking also about the great exception argument, I mean, in the last great era of organizing, let's say in the 30s, immigrant workers then too were at the leading edge of organizing struggles. And and even before that in the needle trades in New York, and then immigrant workers in the CIO and so on. So, there's a way in which what's happening now isn't terribly new. And in addition to sort of the experience of coming to the US and enduring all, everything that was involved with that, there's also, oftentimes people from elsewhere. I mean, 100 years ago from parts of Europe, and today from Latin America, bring with them a political sensibility that is far more radical than what is sort of on average or within the norm among people raised in the U.S. So I think that's another, interesting part of the story. So I guess, and the last question I have before I want to, move into the audience questions is just zooming out a little bit. And we've been talking a lot about the relationship between economic restructuring within the U.S. and immigration. And I wonder if we can close by discussing the role of U.S. empire in all of this. Many people immigrating to the U.S. from Latin America, in particular Central America, are coming from states that have been destabilized as a result of U.S. military intervention or CIA intervention and the like. And so I guess maybe, and to sort of use this to think in terms of what is to be done question, and maybe in terms of thinking about the big question for us, which is, how do we imagine building a transnational working class coalition that can fight for a just immigration policy? To what extent do you think U.S. foreign policy needs to be a target?
It definitely should be part of the mix. And I think it's most obvious in the case of what's happening right now in places like Honduras and the rest of Central America, where the so-called crisis or surge at the border of refugees, and they're not really immigrants in the way I describe in the book. They really are refugees, many of them young children who are fleeing violence and corruption and devastation in their home countries. But so that's where it's really stark. But I think you could. It's clear that U.S. foreign policy has contributed to the so-called push factors motivating immigrants to come to the U.S. What I write about is much more the pull factors, like the knowledge that in the late 20th and early 21st century, at least up to the Great Recession, if you do manage to get here, there's a job waiting for you. Employers want you to come, and people know that. I think that the refugee story is a little different, but in both cases, the lack of opportunity at home is often tied to the policies of the US and other wealthy countries. NAFTA might be one example. Yeah.
Right. Well, and maybe we can get to that in the Q&A. So this is great. I'm going to move into the Q&A. I feel like we've covered kind of where I wanted to go. I know Nelson Lichtenstein is in the audience. One of the practices that we had, and he was my graduate mentor, was always starting with a student question if we had one. And so I see one from a SLU student, Brian McTiernan, asking, does U.S. capital care about immigrants as consumers? And do we have any idea how their departure affects the foreign markets they leave behind?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, actually, there are all sorts of marketing efforts directed at foreign-born consumers. If you ever look at Spanish language TV, for example, you'll see some of that. That's been going on for a long time. And actually, this is another wrinkle in the thing we started with about the supply and demand thing. The fact that immigrants, once they are settled in the US, are consumers and do buy goods and services, actually creates new demand. So contributes to economic growth in all kinds of ways. And yeah, employers and capital more generally is very aware of that, for sure. And what was the second part? What happens to that at home? Well, there is another piece which we haven't discussed, and which I don't really get into in the book, but is relevant to this, which is remittances. Many low-wage immigrants, despite their low wages, manage to send home to their families who remain in their countries of origin significant amount of money that are then contributing to those economies, including to consumption, but also to like building houses and just basic survival. So it's complicated. Yes, the money they might have earned the immigrants might have earned if they'd stayed home isn't there, but they're probably earning a little more here and able to send significant amounts back. So I think it's probably a wash in terms of, I haven't actually looked at this in detail, but they're contributing to consumption in the countries they left behind too, or as long as they remain employed. Right now with the pandemic, et cetera, it's a whole different story. But until then, that was pretty typical.
Yeah, I remember, and don't quote me on this, but it's some very substantial percent of pre-pandemic El Salvador GDP was accounted for by like in the order of like a third or something.
In many countries, in poor countries, that's very often the case.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so I see another question here. One industry, something you talk about a bunch in the book, but which I haven't asked you too much about is agriculture. And we have a question here. How do you see immigrants in agriculture from first generation to longer residency to H-2A workers fitting into the immigrant rights and labor rights movements? And maybe you could talk about this historically and today as well.
Right. Well, so another thing that was happening in my youth as a young person first becoming a political person and so on was, of course, it was the heyday of the United Farm Workers and their great boycotts and so on. And in those days, I should say, many of us thought that, the farm workers themselves announced as one of their goals was to lift up the conditions of farm workers to the level of urban workers. And what we've seen instead is the opposite, that in many occupations, urban employment has been degraded to the level, to the wages and conditions that we might historically associate with farm workers. So that's like one piece of the story. But and related to that, I think in some ways, the employment patterns that developed in agriculture, especially, I'm really talking about the Southwest here, large scale agribusiness, where immigrants have for a long time, for more than a century, dominated the workforce. Those patterns of employment have in some ways become the template for immigrant employment in other sectors. So that's like one piece of the story. But of course, agriculture continues to be a major site of immigrant employment in its own right. And the organizing that the farm workers did back then has not been very active recently, to put it mildly. So, that's one of the main sectors where you see these kinds of issues emerging. One of the things that's happening right now is that, even in the pandemic, of course, agriculture continues this provides food for people. And they are facing shortages of workers at the moment, and also making strenuous efforts to find ways to hold on to the workers they do have, including, I've been reading in the press, offering vaccines on site to workers who might otherwise be fearful of showing up at a vaccination center or something, given that so many farm workers are undocumented. So there's a whole complex set of stories there. But I think that the common ground between agricultural workers and other immigrant workers in the low-wage labor market is pretty large. And although historically you also see a lot of people who come to the US and first work in agriculture moving on to urban employment, which still is more desirable in most cases for a lot of different reasons, and housing and so on. So there's that history too. It's a whole complicated, that's a whole topic in itself, I guess.
Yeah, right. No, this sort of changing, evolving relationship between agricultural and urban employment is really and how it's flipped a little bit, as you say, is very important. And I just want to note for listeners, yesterday the Supreme Court heard oral arguments on a case involving the California Agricultural Labor Relations Act, which, as many of you know, the National Labor Relations Act excluded agricultural workers. And over many years of struggle, farm workers in California won a state level law, which a piece of which is being challenged now in a very aggressive way by some right-wing, legal interests around access to employees. There's concerns that it could be a very big precedent-setting case. So again, article in the New York Times today, like I'm making there's like an ad. I got my requisite New York Times ads in this discussion. So here's another question, and this kind of, you mentioned NAFTA, and I think it's important to touch on trade in this discussion. It says, what relation, if any, is there between greater global trade and the phenomenon you describe? Is NAFTA important not because of the factory jobs that moved or left the US, but because of the surplus of Mexican labor created by the destruction of so much small farming there?
Yeah, many people argue that, especially for agriculture. Although the other thing that's happened in the post-NAFTA years, this is 1994, so it's already a while ago, is a lot of American US-based growers have moved their operations to Mexico, partly because they have so much difficulty recruiting workers here. So it's a kind of dynamic situation. But yeah, that's definitely part of the story. So it's kind of related to your earlier question about empire and the role of US policy in creating push factors, inspiring people to move to the north. So yeah, the more the fewer options there are for you at home, the more attractive immigration may be. But you don't come without, I just want to emphasize it is demand driven at the same time. So the push factors are there and have been for some time. But at the same time, if you think that there's nothing for you north of the border, say right after the crash of 2008, immigration kind of stops dead at that moment because people realize there's not much point in going because there's no jobs even for people born here, like much less for them. So you need both, really.
Right. Here's another question that speaks to a new project Ruth is working on the gig economy. We have a question. Can you talk a bit about the gig economy and what this shift to precarious employment means with respect to immigrant workers, and also unionization efforts with respect to gig workers in the US? How the gig economy figures into the immigration question, the unionization question, and everything we've been talking about?
Boy, that's a big question. Yeah. So there are immigrants in the gig economy, but I don't know if we have great data on this, but my impression is that there are actually more US born workers. They're both. But it is a form of precarious employment, and it really depends where you're talking about. So for example, in New York City, where I usually live, I'm not there at the moment, the food delivery is overwhelmingly something performed by immigrant workers on bikes or electric bikes or whatever. And in other parts of the country, it's actually US born women who dominate that sector. So it just really varies with the local labor market. And New York is also a place that's had food delivery for way longer than other parts of the country for various reasons. So, right. And I think with like the Uber drivers too, there it's people who've been in the country for a while insofar as they're immigrants employed in that sector, um, because you need to have a driver's license and so forth. Um, Taxi workers more generally, that's another sector that used to be a place where US born workers could make a decent living. And as it deteriorated, it became dominated by immigrants in many cities. So I'm not conventional taxis don't count as the gig economy, I guess. But I think, the organizing that's being attempted in that sector, and I think that's the point, attempted. It's very difficult to organize in conventional ways there because of the fact that nominally these are self-employed workers who aren't covered by our labor laws. There have been attempts nevertheless, and some of them have been successful in the way the worker centers are successful, that is in calling public attention to the plight of these workers, which doesn't always work, as we saw in California with that recent proposition. They were outgunned by I think there is a genuine presence of gig workers who prefer not to be conventional employees. That is real. But that proposition probably would have not come out the way it did if it hadn't been for the millions of dollars poured in by Uber and the other companies that wanted to preserve the current arrangement. So yeah, that's kind of a future story. I think the organizing piece, it's just beginning and we'll see what happens, but there aren't any major victories to chalk up on that front just yet. And it's by no means dominated by immigrants. There are immigrants there, but I think it's a much more mixed sector depending on where you're talking about.
Well, so on the question of labor law and precarious worker organizing, we may have time for one more question and one here. So how might the proposed labor reforms, such as the PRO Act, affect immigrant worker organizing, particularly regarding undocumented workers who have historically done jobs like agriculture and others that are excluded from labor and employment laws?
Yeah, I mean, in my view, anything that strengthens the ability to organize is good for both US born workers and immigrant workers. And the PRO Act is a great example of that it could give, be I was going to say a shot in the arm, which I guess has new meaning these days, but, give a boost to organizing efforts across the board. What I basically try to argue in the book, and I, more generally in this context, is that the only way forward really is to try to coordinate the interests of US born and immigrant workers for the common good. That's, if you're really serious about trying to confront the problems of the neoliberal era, this is the only thing that's going to work. Immigrants are here, they're not going home, very few are, some are, but and more are likely to show up. And if you want to be successful in organizing, you need a working class movement that includes everybody. And I think we've learned that in other sectors of the labor market in the past. Like unions used to be very skeptical about including women, for example, back in the day, and learned that this was a permanent part of the workforce and that the way forward was to organize them, not try to exclude them. And I think, that lesson has been learned by organized labor. So if there is a change in the law that makes organizing more possible and more likely to succeed, that's good for everybody.
Well, I mean, I think, do we have any more questions? I like that note to end on, but we do have a couple more minutes if there's another question or two. Let me just sift through here. I'm trying to pluck these out of the chat as we go. Well, there is, okay, here's one that I missed. As much as I do like that note of broad solidarity, I feel like that's a great note to close on. This is a good question as well. So we have, a viewer who's wondering, what are non-immigrant Americans who have exited these jobs doing to make a living instead? Clearly lots of work has been degraded and they can't all be getting better paying or far more comfortable jobs. So what's gone on with workers born in the US who've exited some of these categories we've talked about?
Yeah, I don't have a great answer to that. Unfortunately, it's really hard to know. I mean, in some sectors, like I mentioned, construction, it's clear that some just move into commercial construction from when a residential falls apart. But in most cases, we don't know. But I would remind you that, this has been going on for quite a few decades now. So people sort of age out of jobs as well. There's a certain amount of churning anyway in the labor market. But it's certainly true that, in the early days of all this, it was much easier to migrate into quote unquote good jobs. And as those become more scarce, it becomes much more difficult over time. But that's also a generational story about, the worst prospects in some ways are faced by new labor market entrants who can't, who have very limited options and never had a chance to be in those desirable jobs. And for the older workers involved, some of them, are, working as greeters at Walmart or whatever, have very few options given that on top of everything else, there's a lot of age discrimination in the US labor market that is not being addressed. So yeah, so it's not a happy story for everybody. The younger they are, the more likely they are to be able to land on their feet in some more desirable sector. But that definitely, I mean, again, there just aren't data on that question that I was able to find. So, but it's a great question. Somebody should try to figure that out.
Yeah. No, these have all been great questions. So I guess, I mean, that seems, I think like a good place to put a pin in it. Thanks everyone for joining us. Is really, I think, rich discussion. And Ruth, thank you so much. I encourage everyone to go out and pick up a copy of this wonderful book. It really, I mean, one of the things I was going to say about Ruth at the outset is she manages to find topics that you think you understand pretty well, and then shine a light on them that you're like, oh wait, now I'm going to think about this differently going forward. So this is Immigrant Labor, the New Precariat, out by Polity. Highly recommend everyone taking a look. It's also very succinct and a quick and easy read too. So thank
I'm glad
you.
to hear that. Thank you, Samir.